We all like to live in clean homes. We vacuum, wash, dust, filter the air we breathe. I defer to Jennifer on the cleaning. She does such a great job on that. But we all like to benefit from the profit of living in a clean home. And whatever we're doing in our home, we're filtering. When you are washing or vacuuming or using an air conditioning filter, you're filtering. You're trying to keep the dirt out of your home. You want a clean environment. We can't clean the world, but we can clean our own living space with as much dust-free an atmosphere as it's possible to do. And I want you to consider the parallel tonight of our spiritual well-being internally. I want you to think tonight of our soul, which is the most inner core of our being, is like our home to keep clean. As I mentioned, we can't clean the world, and we can't stay away from ungodly behavior. And we know that from what Paul says in Corinthians about the fact that we can't avoid ungodly people altogether. So we have to filter as much as possible. And I was thinking about that not too long ago and realized that our faith really serves as a filter. Just as we have an air conditioning filter, and as you might guess, I have one here, a regular air conditioning filter. This is a small version of the kind that Jennifer and I have at home. Whether you live in a house or an apartment or even in a hotel, somewhere in that facility, there are air conditioning filters. They're usually in the ceiling, and of course they're positioned like this, and all of the air that's sucked up from the interior of your house is full of debris and pollutants, dirt, and pollen of all kind, and depending on the quality of your filter, it's then filtered through this. It then goes up into the air conditioning duct and then comes back into the air that you breathe as clean air, as clean as possible. There are different qualities of air conditioning filters, but they all have the one thing in common of filtering air. And every few months, we change ours every 4 months. They recommend 3, but you have to use your own judgment. And surely enough, when I take the 2 that we have down from our ceiling, they're usually gray. I remember one particular year when we hadn't done it for more than our usual amount. We took it down, it was almost black, which is actually good. That means the filter is working. Because all that debris and dirt that you see in the filter, all of that gray and dingy color, that would have been in your lungs. And in your eyes. You've been breathing that, but it was filtered out. And I want you to think of our faith as being a filter also. As I said, we can't protect ourselves completely from the outside world, but we can control what comes into it. You can control the people who come into your home. Jennifer and I will not allow people in our home, if they're going to eat or drink or use profane language. Most people come to our home are not like that, but if they did, we would ask them to either stop that or to leave, because we can control that space. And we allow people into our house who will function by our rules and our regulations and what we expect. Our soul belongs to God. We are householders or stewards of the soul that we have. It will return to God someday. And while we are in possession or custodialship of that soul, we have the obligation to keep it as clean as possible. It doesn't mean that we are goody two-shoes. It doesn't mean that we are holier than thou, like we're better than the rest of the world. It means we are trying to serve God, and we serve God from the heart. Proverbs 23:7, which is actually the pivotal verse for our message this evening, is actually talking about an evil person. And that particular verse says simply that as a man thinks, so is he. And I want to take the converse of that. That verse is talking about a man who is evil, and out of his evil heart comes evil behavior. So is he. If a man is evil in the core of his being, he will be an evil man by how he behaves and speaks and conducts himself. I want us to consider either, you might say, the inverse or the converse of that and turn it around. That likewise, as a man thinks in his heart righteously and purely, so he will be as well. But only if he protects his soul. Because if what comes out of the soul determines our behavior and our language the way we are, it's important to keep that clean. Just the way we keep the interior of our house clean. I'll put this here so you can continue looking at it as we go along. But think about our faith as being as a filter as well. And I want you to consider 3 particular aspects of it this evening. That we should filter our thoughts, which we actually can do. You might say, how can you filter your thoughts? We won't talk about that. We can filter our language, the words that we use very clearly, and we can filter our associations. And among those 3 aspects of our lives, pretty much covers our whole social, political, economic life. The way we think, the way we speak, and the way we associate with others. And I want to go through 3 of these, and again, think about our faith as being a filter that screens those contaminants that come into our lives that can spoil us and ruin us and make us a certain way that we should not be. The first question to consider tonight, do we filter our thoughts? Now, think of when the Bible speaks of the heart, like in your heart, you're a certain way, the heart represents our innermost being, our soul. It represents the essence of what we really are, the kind of person you are. What you are is what you are in your heart. And what that means, when you talk about your heart is between you and God, if you think about it. You can fool me, you can fool others, I can fool you, but you can't fool God, and you can't really fool yourself. You can deceive yourself, that's true, but ultimately you know who you are and you know what you are. So in your heart of hearts, you are alone with God, you might say. God knows you and you know yourself. And I want you to think it's another analogy tonight, besides the filter of a computer programmer. We are, just as you program a computer, we also can program ourselves the same way. Our mind is the most magnificent computer on the face of the earth. It always will be. God gave us the ultimate computer. No matter how great computers are around the world with AI and whatever else is going on in technology, it's always human beings that design those computers and make those programs. So the computer will never be greater than the human being, because this brain that we have, though we do corrupt it and pollute it and sometimes ruin it, that mind that God gave us is able to produce computer programs. And so we're talking tonight about a spiritual program. We're so concerned about correctly programming our computers so it keeps out viruses and any kind of contamination. How much more then to control our own soul? And again, go back to Proverbs 23:7. As we think or as we program ourselves, that's how we will be. And so think of sin as software. You go back to Proverbs 23:7, the writer there is talking about an evil man. And we can put evil software into our computer, or we can put righteous software. It's our choice. And I want you to consider James 1:14 and 15 as a good location in the Bible where we can talk about how we can program ourselves. In James 1:14 and 15, James is talking about the ultimate problem of evil, how it gets into our lives. And he says in verses 14 and 15, But every man is tempted, we're all tempted, when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. The next verse goes on to say that eventually lust takes us to sin and takes us to death. If we don't stop the lust from becoming sin, and if we don't stop the sin from taking its course in our life, we will die spiritually. Very serious matter here. But I want you to focus for a minute on verse 14, where the writer talks about the fact that we're all tempted when we're drawn away of our own lust. And I want you to consider as a good example. So the question is, what are we programming in our minds? And I want you to consider a really good example of what I will call the evolution of sin. If you want to see how sin develops, and it's what's got to do with our thoughts, consider 2 Samuel 11:2 through 4, talking about David. David, a great man of God. He was a great man of God who fell but then rose again, as we have the right to do as well. He was a man who sinned greatly. He was a man whom you would read about in the Bible and think, boy, David was a great exemplar of righteousness. He was a godly man, and he was. But he was a great man, he had a great fall, but then he rose again. And we find a whole lot about the problem of David when we look at those verses. Let me just read these verses and go back and pick out what I'm going to call the evolution of sin, how that sin really unrolls or progresses. And it came to pass one evening that David rose from his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself. And whether she was totally without clothing or adorned to the extent that she aroused him, he saw her washing herself. And the woman was very beautiful to look upon, which adds to the desire to look at her. In verse 3, and David sent and inquired about the woman. In verse 4, and David sent messengers and took her, that is, brought her to his chambers, and she came unto him, and he lay with her. If you go through and look at all three of those, you will see a look and a stare, a desire of sin, and then Luckily for me, it didn't become a lifelong habit. It could have become a habit. The danger with sin, we'll talk about later, when it becomes a habit. But if you'll notice in all the verbs you see in that passage, he saw, she was beautiful, he inquired, as he went beyond just looking, he went to thinking about her and asking about her, and then finally he sent messengers to bring her to him because he wanted her. He wanted her in the wrong way. And the very ending of verse 4, he lay with her. There was the adultery right there. He committed adultery. He caused a man to die. It was a great sin. He went on to regret that, as we should all regret sin, and later on said, my sin is ever before me. But again, I want you to go back and look at the very first thing. He looked at her. And what this has to do with filtering our thoughts. You might say, how can you control your thoughts? Well, the thoughts in our mind come from two areas, our own ideas. But if you think about it, many, many ideas come to us from without. Other people, other things, other words come into our minds. And then the question is, what do we do with those? When we see certain things, like when David saw this lady, and when we hear certain things, profanity, obscenity, whatever it might be, these things are out there, just like the contaminants that might go through a filter. But if we have the right kind of faith, just like an air conditioning filter, we can actually keep out those contaminants. Because if David had done the right thing, and I'm sure he knew that later on, when he looked, you can't help looking. When he was walking along and saw her, you can't help seeing things around you. If you hear somebody swearing around you, you've already heard this profanity, you can't stop it, it's already there. And if you see something that caused you to lust, you've still seen it. But the thing is to stop right there and look away, run away, turn away. And whether you literally run away or run away in your mind by turning it off, if David had stopped his look right there and thought, that is not right, what I'm about to start to think, then he would have turned away right there, but he didn't. Because that look then became a stare. How do I know that? Because she was beautiful to look upon. And what that implies is that he was looking at, he was then staring at her, and then he goes beyond that to inquire about her, and then he actually takes her in adultery. And so the look led to a stare, led to desire, led to the sin, which in the problem of our problem of thought, it can often lead to a habit. And so we can filter our thoughts by stopping something before it starts. And you might say, well, that's hard to do. No, it's really not. When you hear something, somebody speaking, turn away from that person. Sometimes you can't do that. I realize that. When you're at work sometimes, certain things you see and certain things you hear, you can't help it. But inasmuch as it's possible for you to pray to God for His help and strength, you turn away. I mentioned in my class this morning about the conscience that Paul often, when he prays for the saints, many times he doesn't pray for temptation to be taken away, like you make it easy on him. He just says, I pray that you'll have the strength to resist the temptation. And what Paul is saying there is, I hope you'll have the strength and the power and the godly character that when you see or hear something around you that's ungodly, you turn away from it, avert it, don't look at it. You don't have to look at something if you don't want to. You don't have to hear something. And that's the whole point. So my concluding point there is, do not let a thought then solidify into a lifestyle. And what James says in 1:14-15 is, if you let the progression go, it will. If you let that thought become a desire, become a sin, become a habit, it will become a lifestyle if you don't stop it. It will solidify into a way of living. Don't do that. A second way we can filter our lives, like filtering with an air conditioning, is the question, do we filter our words? David talked about this recently, made some good points about it. Every word we speak originates as a thought. David brought this out, and linguistically he was correct. When words come out of your mouth, no matter what you say to apologize for them, that's what you were thinking. I hear people often say, oh, excuse my profanity, excuse my French. They want to euphemize it. No, you meant to say that, okay? Now, you might apologize it once it comes out. You might even regret it. But what came out of your mouth and if I ask you this question, think about it psychologically and linguistically. When you speak, where does that word come from? Say, my tongue. It's not your tongue. Oh, from my throat. Oh, your vocal apparatus. It comes from your mind. That's where it starts. It originates. And that being the case, then whatever comes out of your mind. Now, whether it comes out deliberately, where you thought about it for half an hour and then said it, Or whether you say it impulsively. In a moment of passion, you say something, it still came from up here. So whatever comes out does reveal who we really are. And so we can screen those things. We can do that. 2 suggestions of ways we can screen our words. Because you might say, Jack, I can't screen my words. Yeah, you can. If you think. Often we don't think when we speak. I'm guilty of that too. We say things when we're upset or angry. That's a part of impetuosity or being impulsive. But I'm going to give you 2 suggestions how we can actually curtail that. One is to leash our lips. In Proverbs 10 and verse 19, the writer says, in the multitude of many words, that is talking too much, in the multitude of words there wants not sin. Was if you speak a lot and speak a lot, if you're very loquacious and just talk all the time, those people are really annoying, you know. They just talk and talk and talk, and even when they're speaking something, you know, they're still annoying because they won't be quiet. And I'm making a serious point. The danger of talking and talking and talking so much is, in a multitude of words, there's a good chance something may come out you might regret later. So if you're speaking more than you're thinking, you might want to reverse that and think before you speak. Because the other side of that passage in verse 19 is, but he that refrains his lips is wise. It doesn't mean you have to be quiet all the time and be reticent. You can speak, but refrain the lips means to think before you speak. James 1:19 adds on to that thought, complements it by saying then, let every man be swift to hear and slow to speak. That is, be eager to hear other things. To hear people, to hear what they're saying, that's fine. When someone's speaking to you, listen and listen and listen. But before you respond, be slow. He means be slow in your mind, not your speech pattern. Think before you speak. Once you've heard whatever you need to hear, and whether you're giving advice to somebody, or whether you're responding to somebody in a moment of maybe even anger, think before you speak. Because when you speak and let your lips just kind of go off on a leash or no leash at all, like a dog off of a leash, who knows where your tongue's going to go that you might regret later. And another part of that is to tame our tongues, which goes along with the same idea. In Proverbs 11 and verse 13, we're told that a talebearer, a gossip reveals secrets, but he that is of a faithful character conceals the matter. There are many times when it's a case where we hear something where maybe it's true, it's completely true, but we don't need to be talking about it. Sometimes people often think, well, the only thing you shouldn't gossip about are lies and rumors. No, some things that you are told, especially in confidence, keep your mouth closed. Or in your own judgment, if you have godly character, if you hear something about somebody, and you realize, I shouldn't be talking about that publicly, then don't talk about it. I believe the writer's talking about that here. We need to tame our tongues. You hear something, you think, oh boy, I want to go out and tell somebody. Stop and ask yourself for a minute, what good will that do? And we have to realize the basic rule of what these verses are implying is that if our words do no one any good, why speak them? And of course the answer is don't speak them at all. And this is not new with me, but remember this idea that words can never be unspoken or unsaid. Once you speak something, it's out there. And if damage is going to come from your words, that damage is already done. Now, some will say, but Eastham, I've said some horrible things to people. Well, yeah, we should apologize. And we should regret what we've said that was wrong to hurt people. We can do that. But my point is, why not stop and think before those words even go out when you hurt somebody? Because sometimes when you hurt people or dishonor people or betray them by your words that were ill-spoken, it may take a long time to get that friendship back or that trust back because people remember those words. Maybe they don't remember them with the idea of like getting back at you, but they hurt and they sting sometimes. And so don't say them to begin with. So leash our lips and tame our tongues, as these Proverbs suggest, and that's one way of filtering our words. The last thing we can filter is our associations. And we have to be careful about this because sometimes there are people around us who think, as I said before, oh, you think you're better than I am because you don't. It's not the attitude of like, oh, I'm better than you are, and you put your nose in the air like, I'm not going to switch. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the people with whom you are most intimate in your associations, who are closest to you, the ones who are most likely to influence you, those people we have to watch out about. The first point to bear in mind when we answer the question, do we filter our company, is we have to lay aside that in 1 Corinthians 5:10, Paul assures us we cannot escape the ungodly. You can't get away from ungodly people. God doesn't expect that. To the contrary, we're supposed to be the salt of the world and the light of the world, so we need to be living out there to cast our influence. But we may think, I wish I didn't have to be around those people, ungodly people. Well, you don't. And again, I realize sometimes you're at work or places where you can't get away. I realize that. In the case you have to bear, pray to God, and just hold up and do the best you can till you can get away from them. But many times we actually choose our associations. We choose our friends. And when we do that, we're taking a big chance. Proverbs 13:20 has a really good piece of advice about the danger of hanging around with the wrong people. Proverbs 13:20 says, "He that walks with wise men, godly men, shall be wise, but a companion of fools shall be destroyed." Basically what it's saying is if you hang around and associate with people who are wise and godly, their behavior is going to reinforce yours. You'll both become stronger. It's like steel rubbing steel. They both kind of temper and harden each other that way. But if you associate with fools on a regular basis, their influence is going to come through. Now, we have to realize also that we can't blame our friends when we're around them and we do things, but the thing is, their influence comes through. I've heard police officers often say, and I love police officers, they do a great work for us. I've heard some of the detectives, especially undercover people, say that when they get out and have to associate with a really ungodly criminal element, I mean some of the lowest people, the dregs as we call them, that are just into drugs and alcohol and all kinds of crime. So when I'm out there around those people, because that's my job, it has a debilitating effect on me. You know, it kind of pulls me down and I have to get out of it after a while. It's almost like, you know, where there's sewage or slime or dirt just kind of getting all over you. It's all around you. Sometimes there's a danger of that getting in, but we can filter that. An example I used about a year or two ago in another sermon, I'm going to use it again because it fits in perfectly here, about influence of our group around us and our individual behavior. And I mentioned this before, so bear with me if you've heard this. But when I was in the 6th grade, 11 years old, I was out at the bus stop behind a Circle K, Phoenix, Arizona, Holiday Park Elementary School we were attending. The bus came by to pick us up as it did every morning. And when I was out there, I was with Chris Henson and Tom Borgstadt, two of my buddies. I have good memory. Maybe not the best possible buddies, though, because I think there was another person, I've forgotten who it was. I think it was Michael Pavlik, I don't know. Anyhow, there were 2 or 3 boys there, and we were back. The other kids were out in the front waiting to get on the bus, and we were out there kind of toward the back of the store, and they said, "Hey, let's skip school." Back in my day, I've forgotten the term we used, but it was ditch. We were ditching school, skipping it. And I stood there, little dummy I was, you know, because they were my friends, and they said, "Come on, Jack, let's go." And so they walked out into the really high weeds behind the store to kind of hide in the weeds. Bus went by and picked up, and they took off. And they thought, man, they thought we were so cool. I didn't. Like, oh man, we're skipping school, we're cool. No, we were actually stupid. That was a dumb thing to do. That went on to be, by the way, the most boring days of my life. It really was. I regretted it. But the point I'm making is this. Here's a very serious point. I don't blame them for my decision. I let them influence me. When I went back there in those weeds to go along with them, that was my decision. I'm not blaming them at all. However, I know for an absolute fact that if I had not been with them that moment, I wouldn't have done that. I know I wouldn't. I would have gotten on the bus with the other kids and gone to school. But because I was with them and I let their influence seep into me, which it did, I didn't filter it out. I kind of thought, yeah, skip school, okay. And I just kind of went along with them. I was sorry, I regretted having done that. It's maybe a silly example, but it makes the point that sometimes we're around people and we will do things we wouldn't normally have done if we weren't there. So even though I don't blame them, I blame myself for it. If I hadn't been with them, I wouldn't have done that. I know I wouldn't. And we need to bear that in mind. And then the question so we can filter our closest company by associating with those of the best possible influence. And whether it's godly young Christians like the young people here, or people of other congregations, or just good examples around us of godly people, wherever they might be, the point is, be with those people. It doesn't mean to shun the others, because we want to be good influence on everybody around us. But your intimate people, the ones that you would invite into your home, or not invite, now we're talking about your soul. So ask yourself the question, which people will you invite into your soul? Because those people will have an influence on you for better or worse. So do you want the wise people to come into your heart, godly people who cherish the same values you do? Or do you want to take that chance on letting people in, like my so-called friends in 6th grade who led me to do something I shouldn't have done? And the real question to ask when you think about these friends, are those who lure you to sin really your friends? That's the question to consider. This evening we've talked about a filter, as our faith is a filter. And it's very important that we think about our thoughts and our words and our behavior and our associations and filter out those things that would otherwise contaminate us and then make us have an evil heart like Proverbs 23:7 and then become that way. If you're here this evening and you haven't begun to filter your life, the best way to filter your life is to take on Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. To be baptized into His body, to become a child of God, is to take on that filter, the filter that will take you throughout life. If you haven't done that, we would encourage you to do it tonight. Or if it's sometime in the past you have done that, but you have gone astray, as David did, and you want the prayers of the church, you want help with others to forgive you, we would encourage you to think about that and come forward tonight as we all stand and sing.